Okay, so now we are to the big man himself, Charles Darwin. Right, Charles Darwin. He came from a fairly prestigious family. His grandfather was a very famous physician, Erasmus Darwin, who dabbled in a lot of things, including evolutionary theory. Um, Darwin, though, when he was sent away to school and university, yeah, he was a bad student. He did really bad. I mean, really bad in school. Uh, so they finally, switched his degree program, moved him to Cambridge. He was at someplace else, moved him to Cambridge. His father thought that he's going to turn out to be a shame for the family and embarrass us all. Of course, he did not end up doing that. So at Cambridge, he majored in whatever they do over there in England, the Anglican Church. He studied to be a clergyman, uh, and he still just did really mediocre, right, at university. But he loved field experimentation and field work, especially in terms of collecting bugs and beetles. They call it entomology. And he loved that kind of field work so much. He came to know, right, geologists and botanists and that sort of stuff. So he enjoyed all of that type of field work. And it's through those connections with a botanist that he actually got recommended by this guy to go and serve as basically the botanist of this voyage of the Beagle. The ship is the Beagle, HMS Beagle. That was going to go all the way around the world and study, nature and do scientific research all around the world. Um, uh, he didn't get paid, right? His father had to pay for the whole thing, which they say in there he wasn't going to do, but then he did. Well, thank goodness for that, right? That he did. So he went on this, unpaid, but he was the official botanist of the expedition, and he studied, obviously, animals and all sorts of things. And it turned out to be a 5-year voyage, right, to sail all the way around the world. Yeah, talk about long time to travel back then, huh? But anyway, so he gathered lots of examples of plants and animals from all over the world, especially the thing that's talked about the most with him in his famous voyage on the Beagle was the stop of the Beagle in the Galapagos Islands. So these are, pretty pretty isolated islands, right, in the southern Pacific, close to relatively close to South America, I guess, but still, relatively by themselves, right? So they'd go from island to island to island, and there are these birds. These are the most, this is the one that's talked about the most with him, these finches, these birds. Now, these islands were fairly close to each other, yet the finches were different on each island, had different characteristics on each island. So they're the same species, but on one island they have a longer beak, right? On a different island there's something else different. So each island was sort of its own unique environment. And in each of these unique environments, these finches would have different characteristics that best fit that island, that environment on that island, right? So that's what's talked about the most, his studying of the finches in the Galapagos Islands, where people can go and be tourists and see all that stuff nowadays, right? But anyway, so he collected, thousands and thousands of samples, right? All sorts of animals, all sorts of bugs, all sorts of plants, 5 years worth of data. And, you only comb through it yourself. It takes forever, right? So, but he did gather a bunch of data and is trying to make sense out of it. And in trying to make sense out of it, he came across, and they mentioned this in there, this Malthus, right? Thomas Malthus, who was an economist, I believe, who wrote a book about basically food supply and the population of Earth, human population, right? And how in the 1800s, they started to have concern that, oh my God, the human race is, growing exponentially, and in terms of food, we're not growing as fast. So there was this huge worry that we're going to end up with a human population that's not going to be able to be fed. We're going to have crises, and oh my God, it's going to be the end of the world, right? Of course, you have that kind of stuff nowadays too, end of the world, right? About everything. But anyway, but Malthus said that that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen. That there are going to be natural events, right? Of course, not all of them natural, but but there will be natural events, natural catastrophes, earthquakes, all that kind of stuff. But there will also be other things like wars. And so really we don't need to worry about the human population outgrowing the food supply, because the human population will be checked by these natural and unnatural occurrences, right? So there is an interaction sort of between the human population and these events, right? And so that got Darwin's mind ticking, right? Charles Darwin's mind ticking. And he worked on his famous book on the origin of species, right? By means of natural selection, of course. He worked on this book for over 20 years, right? He's going through all this data, publishing bits and pieces about plants, animals, all this kind of stuff. But he's also writing his book for over 20 years. But he realized, you still needed to be careful, right, about talking about some of these ideas, that this could still be somewhat dangerous, right, for somebody to be talking about all this stuff that on the surface, might seem to be incompatible with God creating the universe. So anyway, but anyway, he's one of these people in the field that's talking privately with others about this stuff. And there's another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, right, who had made some observations in his travels in the Amazon and so forth. I think at the time he was living in Australia or someplace like that. And he wrote a letter to Darwin outlining a theory that he had about evolution. And it was like really similar to Darwin's theory. So Darwin said, oh, hell, I need to publish. Right, basically. But they did arrange through somebody else to have both their papers read at a professional organization, both the theories, and no one paid any attention. Right? But then just months later, just within months, Darwin published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, right? Just a couple months later. So he had it all ready. He had the theory worked out. He had, tons of data, right, supporting his theory. And if you've seen this book, it's a really thick book, right? So that's why we give Darwin the credit for creating, for discerning the theory of evolution through natural selection, right? He and Wallace came up with it about the same time. I dare say Darwin probably came up with it first, but both of them were talking about it about the same time. But then Darwin had this massive book ready with tons of data supporting his theory, right? So we give Darwin the credit for it, right? So obviously, in his theory of evolution, it's that through natural selection that I mentioned in a previous video, that's key, right? So it was like in Malthus's theory that you'll have the struggle for survival and that kind of thing, but natural events will balance it out, in terms of the food supply. So so he saw that there's this natural struggle for survival in members of a species in a particular environment, right? But a key factor that must be there, for evolution through natural selection to take place, is variability in the species, right? There has to be variability in the species, right? So there are individual differences that are present in the species. And this is one thing they say that's very important here in terms of the kind of research Darwin's theory of natural selection encouraged. It encouraged interest in individual differences. So this really did spur interest unfortunately, later in this chapter, in the field of intelligence as an individual difference in human beings, but also personality or any other individual difference we get all excited about nowadays, mindfulness, whatever it might be, but individual differences, right? This is what his theory started, this interest in individual differences and how do these various individual differences enable some, right, to survive better than others. And so he called it this, there's this natural selection. It's an interaction between members of a species and the environment in which they live. All right? So it's an interaction. Natural selection happens in a specific environment. All right? You can't separate it from an environment. So once again, they make the point in here, there's no goal to it or anything. You know, you're not progressing towards perfection or anything. You know, it's just and they talk about this in there. If you have an adaptation that helps members of a species survive in an environment, well, that's what fitness is. Fitness is an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. All right, in a specific environment. So you can't separate evolution through natural selection from the environment in which the species evolved. And of course, you have to have individual differences in the species for this to take place, right? So that's very, very important, right? Very important. So yeah, this idea that we're evolving towards perfection, it's ridiculous. You evolve to fit a particular environment. That's it, right? So they mention all of that, and and on the origin of species, Darwin did not really talk about humans much and think about the implications for that, because once again, that would be controversial. But his books, sold out immediately, and they had to make additional printings of it ever since. So yeah, it's just amazing. They do mention a few of his works that are most relevant for psychology, although you have the early school of psychology of functionalism that's influenced by Darwinian theory, because the functionalists were always interested in what is the function or the purpose of a behavior. And they're always thinking that from an evolutionary point of view. The purpose of a behavior is to enable an organism to survive and reproduce. And they also mention the behaviorists, and they talk about classical and and instrumental or operant conditioning, but once again, how did these evolve? Because they help the organism survive and reproduce, right? So it influenced a lot of psychology and still does to this day. But Darwin did write a book, right? The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, right? The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, where he thought that initially, species initially had to bite and scratch, right, to survive. They had to do that. But then he thought it sort of evolved into just me being able to, to just look frickin' mean, and that would get the signal across, don't cross me, right? So it evolved from a particular action to just a facial expression that communicated that feeling to somebody else, right? And he did believe that these facial expressions existed cross-culturally. So all humans have these facial expressions, and of course there's still research in the area of facial expression of emotions in psychology to this day, right? So you can take pictures of people and show me a happy face, a sad face, a surprised face, and you can show that to other humans all around the world. Everybody will recognize the emotions from those facial expressions. So it is something that evolved in us, these facial expressions. So he's important for emotion research. And then they mention, of course, he made a study of his son, William, as he was developing as a child. So he kind of pioneered developmental psychology, and obviously pioneered anything that would look at humans as if they are animals, or at least that sees humans as being not qualitatively different from animals, but quantitatively different, right? So you got psychobiology, physiological psychology, animal psychology, emotions, genetics, tests and measurements, all that stuff is coming from the interest he generated in individual differences. So he really did influence a lot of psychology and a lot of the different areas of psychology. And then, of course, eventually they do mention we get from Darwin, because one problem for evolutionary theory in terms was always in terms of explaining altruistic acts. How, because so they used to think, and Darwin thought of in terms of what evolution is about, is me surviving long enough to have my own offspring, right? But sociobiology came later on, and some of you have heard this in like my psychology of learning class, kin selection theory, right? Kin selection theory or inclusive fitness. They mention that in the book, where we know now it's not about me individually reproducing. Uh, that's not the only way for me to get copies of my genes in future generations. Another way for me to get copies of my genes into future generations is by helping those I'm biologically related to, because I share genes with them. So that can help explain why something like an altruistic act would be actually selected for through evolution, through natural selection, right? And that can help explain, yeah, all sorts of things, religion, morality, all of that stuff, because through those things we are helping propagate our genes into future generations, so those could be selected for. But anyway, I better stop there. That's Darwin.